let me give you the conclusion of my talk right now. Jonathan asked the question, what is needed now going forward? And the conclusion is we need more research. So just so you know, for those of you who are really hungry, you can go now and have lunch. The rest is just annotation to fill in the gaps. I want to thank my colleague, Jim Spohrer from IBM, who has been a collaborator with me on this going all the way back. As you'll see in just a moment, this is a very large, very complex area. Many of you have done excellent work here. We will probably offend many of you just because in the time I have, I will not be able to cite all of the good work you have also done as part of this. So please accept my apologies in advance. And my talk is inevitably retrospective, partial, incomplete, biased, all of those things that many of us now have learned to study in these processes. But nonetheless, I think there's some interesting insights that I learned from pulling this together, and I hope that you find them interesting as well. So to begin with where this started, at the risk of stating the obvious, whether you look at the largest countries by the size of their labor force, or whether you look over time in any one country, either the cross-sectional view or the longitudinal view will show you that services are becoming a vastly larger part of economic activity. Again, at the risk of stating the obvious. What also became interesting, though, is at this level, at the macroeconomic level, when you drill down to individual firms, it's often the case that for many of the firms themselves, including firms we used to think of as primarily agricultural, or firms we used to think of as primarily manufacturing, their own businesses are often shifting towards services as well. So from the large scale down to the more specific level, we see this rise of services there as well. And what I'm showing you here is, in this case, is IBM, and look how large that has become, and look how small it used to be. So the company has truly transformed itself in this process. And as I'm going to argue in a few minutes, this is not an easy transformation to make. It may sound very effortless that things naturally evolve towards services. There is indeed an evolutionary process, but there is adaptation, but there's a lot of selection that goes on in this process and a lot of very difficult problems to overcome in managing such a transition. When we began to think about what Jonathan described as a more robust language to make sense of services, service systems, and for me specifically, innovation in services, we found ourselves having to grapple with a very poorly defined, complex situation. To give you a sense of the world I lived in, for those of you who are familiar with open innovation, a lot of that work emanated from close study of companies' R&D processes inside their research laboratories. Well, for those of you who work in the services domain, you already know that many of these companies don't have R&D laboratories. So it's a very different context. And what is the same and what's different is an important thing to sort out. And what I'm showing you here is like the parable of the blind man touching the elephant. We know that services are becoming a larger, much more important part of economic activity. But each of us come at it from our own academic discipline, our own particular training that we've had as scholars. And of course, it's important that we build on and make use of the academic training that we've had. But I think if we're really going to grapple with what's going on in services, we're going to also have to find a way to get out of our own individual academic discipline, or in industry terms, we would say getting out of our own functional silo and comprehend the whole beast. And this is going to involve activities in computer science, but it's also going to involve cognitive science, system engineering, operations, economics, marketing. And if you pushed Jim and I for a definition of, well, what is this thing? beast. It's not a very elegant definition, unfortunately, but it at least gets at, I think, both the complexity and maybe the essence of it, which is this idea of the transdisciplinary study of service systems and value co-creation. So there's going to be part of this in the technical domain. There's going to be part of this in the social domain. We're going to need more than one discipline to really understand this. And much of the real power is going to come from connecting these disciplines together. Again, as I told you, this is a partial, biased, personal view, but this is something that animated us in our thinking. When this began as services science, I played a small role in helping IBM to conceive this in the following sense. What I'm showing you here is IBM had their 100th anniversary as an organization. And one of the things they did to celebrate their 100-year anniversary is they looked back over their own history and identified 100 events that were subsequently important for them as a corporation that they thought had larger implications for society. And this view of services is actually one of the 100 things that they nominated. And what I pointed out to them was, where did the field of computer science come from? There was a famous expression by Thomas Watson Sr. in 1943 that there was a worldwide demand for maybe 7 computers. Some of us who are old enough can remember this statement. And the reason he said such a thing, even though he's making these devices, is that these had a very limited purpose, primarily for calculating ballistic missile trajectories. And there were only so many countries that had ballistic missiles that would need to calculate such trajectories. And after you added up about 7, you pretty much exhausted the list circa that period of time. Well, of course, happily for us, Watson's estimate proved way low in terms of the number of these devices that we're going to need. And that's because we found many, many more uses for these devices. But the computer science field didn't naturally arise from that. There were computers after the war, and they were being used in physics departments for calculating experimental conditions and for physics. They were being used in math departments to do things like calculating pi out to ever more decimal points and other mathematical uses. They were also being used in engineering schools as tools to model and the computational elements of the modeling that were going on in engineering schools. So you had at least 3 deep academic disciplines vying for computers. And it could have been the case that we would have had some computers used for physics, some computers used for math, some used for engineering. But instead, a new field emerged. A field that actually integrated the uses of these 3 earlier academic disciplines and became known as computer science. And the first course in computer science was actually taught at Columbia University in 1946 in a course that a Columbia professor ran with somebody from IBM. They were the first ones to teach a computer science class. Throughout the rest of the 40s and throughout the 1950s, IBM donated computers to many universities around the world. And they didn't simply give the machinery. They also gave a curriculum of computer science to use to make computation itself the subject of academic study. So this is where computer science began. It didn't come from the NSF. It didn't come from DARPA. It didn't come from someplace in the EU, some big research program. It came from a private company, IBM. So this is something I pointed out to them. And my argument was, gentlemen and ladies, this is how your own history developed. And it's fair to say that although you made a lot of donations at the beginning, it's worked out pretty well as a business for you too, hasn't it? What about services? We don't have a language. We don't have a systematic way of thinking about services, and yet you are getting more than half of your business from these things called services. Don't you need to tackle this the way you tackled computer science? So it's an argument by analogy. Like any such argument, there are many counter-arguments to make to such a thing. But in the 2006 paper that Jonathan referenced, Jim Spohrer and I essentially put this out to the world and said, yeah, we think this is needed. And it isn't about one company. One company can't do this. It has to be an effort of a community of organizations, individuals, research funding sources, and the like. And so where this began to go further, in a program, a white paper that came out of a conference at Cambridge, at the Judge Institute, they took stock back in 2008 of kind of what was going on and tried to do some categorization, some taxonomy in the domain, because it is a very complex area. And as you're going to see in the next few slides, how do you make sense of all that complexity? And this is what came out of that research report and conference. There are a set of things around innovation that have to be dealt with. There are systems that incorporate these innovations and take them into the marketplace. Then there are the things that abstract from the systems and allow us to innovate in a more conceptual mechanism. And this is where we're going to be cutting across academic disciplines. Then there are stakeholders that draw on these, and then there are specific actions that need to be taken by the research community to do this. So here, they not only said more research is needed, they said it's needed by 2015. So they even had a deadline for it. This can then be exploded into yet more complexity, where you see many of the academic disciplines featured here. And these academic disciplines affect both the stakeholders, the resources brought to bear, the change process, and the value co-creation process that, cutting across, generate these outcomes. And then there are domains, there are systems or vertical markets, then there are more focused areas. All of these, as you see, this is getting more and more and more complex. One of the challenges I think we face as a field in this area is how to make order out of the complexity. And if we simply create an ever more complex representation, we probably haven't really cracked the problem. So that was from the academic side. If we go to the industry side, there was a survey done at Arizona State by Ostrom and her colleagues looking for how service research leaders see their issues. And so whether the priorities, the development, the execution, they had a rather shorter list of things they needed to see. But each of these, again, cut across those boundaries and cut across those disciplines. So this is a somewhat more focused action agenda from the perspective of the people out there trying to do it. And if you take that and take our disciplines and array those against the systems, you can create a more simplified matrix that still can be exploded and cascaded into all the complexity you saw a few slides ago, but we're beginning to get some more meta traction to try to make it more simple without losing some of the essential richness of what we're doing. And so as a result, a number of volumes and studies have come out of this. There have been more than 200 books. I haven't even counted all the articles. Many of you have contributed to this. And these are representations at a graduate level, at an undergraduate level, just for people trying to get a job done, particularly building on the theory of constraints that Goldratt used earlier for those of you in operations. So there's a lot of translation that's beginning to happen, taking some of this complexity and mapping it now into the actions of particular actors in the system. And this is one of the ways I think the field needs to move, is we have to develop good translations that are actionable for some of the stakeholders that receive this. And indeed, I'm going to share with you in a minute one of my own translations as I was thinking about how to marry open innovation to this service science construct. I think a very powerful, robust finding that works at the level of the individual, the level of the team, the level of the organization, and higher up in group and society levels is this notion of a T-shaped approach to organizing the human resources. And by the T, we mean in the base of the T, we have that academic depth or discipline, the rigor that comes from a very thorough study of a particular domain. And we still need that. But increasingly, to accomplish the task of putting those different pieces of the elephant together, we need to supplement the base of the T with the transept, the cross of the T, where we see the ability to understand other areas and be able to intelligently interact with them and draw from their expertise. So you're not going to be able to replicate that expertise, but because you have a certain level of it, you can draw from it to inform your own work and then in turn help your work contribute to theirs. So in the beginning we said a T shape. You'll now hear expressions like maybe what we really mean is pi, with the crossbar and now 2 or more. But the idea is we need both the depth and a certain amount of breadth to connect these things. And so what Jim adds to this is not simply looking at the academic discipline, but the type of a system you're working in and the type of a culture that you're working in as well. Because different cultures and different systems will have different arrangements of how we interact these things and how they come together. So I think this is a very powerful, robust finding across many papers about one of the human aspects of making this possible. And just to pick on Berkeley for a moment, where I'm from most of the year, Berkeley does a great job in giving a PhD in one field. You don't get a PhD at Berkeley if you're doing a great job of piecing together other people's work. It's the base of the T that gets you the advance of knowledge that qualifies for the PhD. And yet what we're arguing here is that that's necessary but not sufficient to the task of connecting these things together. I'm told that in Thailand they actually have a graduate degree that is a more integrative degree of both engineering and systems, where there is some of the T-shaped in that program. But I'm not aware of many graduate level programs that are yet taking this on. So for those of us from the academic sector, this is something we may want to think about. We still need to nurture the base of the T, absolutely. But in the training of human capital that we provide to the rest of society, are we doing enough to create these T-shaped people that we're arguing now are going to be needed in the future? Another thing that's interesting is to look at team composition in a world of a services project. And so as IBM looks across many of their own engagements with their clients, they're finding that team composition and the roles in those teams are evolving as well. It's a bit of a simplification, but only a bit to say, before, IBM's teams had a salesperson and there were lots of specialists and there was somebody running the project. And this is kind of the old team composition for doing engagements. But with this services approach and that T shape, the teams themselves begin to take on different functions, and that means they need new roles to be played. So you'll see somebody that's really focused on the value side. You'll see somebody who is focused on the architecture of how this is all going to come together over the life cycle of the system. So this is not only across disciplines, it's also across time, how this can sustain over time. And then, of course, this has got to be connected to the operations. One thing you don't see here, but I see in the teams that I study, is you'll see new disciplines on these teams. So you'll see sociologists, you'll see ethnographers, even a few economists in these teams. So we're pulling, they still have PhDs, but they have PhDs from an ever-broadening, more diverse set of skills that are being brought to bear on these projects. All right, so having said a lot about the complexity and the evolution, let me offer a translation of my own to try to show how we can draw from this to help organizations make this transition to a much more service-focused approach to innovation. So I'm going to be drawing from a lot of what you just heard, but I'm putting it into language I think will help it go farther inside organizations. And so I like to motivate it with a specific example. And the example I like to use is of a product that essentially falls into a commodity trap. And by a commodity trap, I mean a situation where as you innovate more and more with that product, even though you're still executing a lot of those projects effectively, you're getting less and less profit and reward from the market for doing so, so that your product becomes more and more commoditized. So a great field, to give a quick example that's widely accessible, is the area of cell phones and cell phone handsets. It was not long ago that Motorola had a fantastic success with the Razr, with this really cool industrial design, and this idea of design thinking to really make a much more elegant handset. And it worked really well for them, and they sold a whole bunch of them, became the world's #1 cell phone manufacturer. But when they came out with the follow-on product, the follow-on handset, the Razr, which most of us have never heard of, the Razr did not differentiate in the way that the Razr did. On the one hand, other people making handsets quickly understood the value of industrial design. Their handsets began to look a whole lot cooler, a whole lot thinner, and so forth. So that aspect that was differentiating at one moment in time was pretty quickly lost later on, and then the new features the Razr offered were not valued in the marketplace. By contrast, a rival to Motorola, Nokia, comes up with the clamshell design, riding the GSM wave into market leadership in the cell phone handsets. We also see some new entrants coming in from Asia, from both Korea and Taiwan, and Motorola becomes an also-ran, and last month was finally acquired by Google. But the story isn't over, because Nokia, the new winner in the space that overtakes and replaces Motorola, has their own challenges. On the one hand, they execute very well the goal of becoming a global manufacturer, globally low cost, global brands, very strong marketing positions in precisely the emerging markets where most of the growth is coming from. So you'd say, boy, this is really good academic performance. They're doing all the things we tell them in our textbooks to do, to be a world leader. Michael Porter has this idea of sustainable business strategies. And one of the Porterian strategies is to be the global low-cost producer. And that is, according to him, one of the ways you sustain industry leadership. So full marks to Nokia for pulling it off. But you know where this is going, right? They fall into a somewhat different trap. It's a version of the commodity trap, but to be fair, it's not the same one that happened to Motorola. Because in Motorola, they taught the world about how to make more elegantly designed handsets, and then the rest of the world quickly learned that lesson. In Nokia's case, the problem was slightly different. It became more of a service system, a gateway for many applications and services that use the phone as an access device. So instead of phones being used just to make point-to-point phone calls, they're now used in a whole variety of use cases that weren't traditionally very important. And so when you're thinking about global low-cost production and branding and so forth, you're really thinking about the product. The transition that happened to poor Nokia is that this became an access point for a variety of services. And companies like Apple and Google really led the charge here. Neither of which, by the way, even didn't engineer these things. They bring them together from others. In the case of Google, they don't even make any hardware. It's a pure software play. So as a result, Nokia, they just got overtaken last month by Samsung in terms of their unit share. And they're struggling now with Microsoft to try to get back into the game. But the game has changed. It's now much more about the applications and the services. It's not anymore about the handset and the product. So this means one way to get out of the commodity trap, an escape route, is for companies to think about their business as a service business, even if they're making products. Precisely because in a product conception, you too can fall prey to the globalization of production, the increased globalization of R&D, global supply chains. Everybody now knows how to use Six Sigma to improve quality outcomes. That's a widely disseminated skill, thanks in part to the work many of you, I suspect, have done. Also, supply chain management, ERP systems, again, things that many of you work on, are also now very well known around the world. So doing these things well at one point in time was truly differentiating. I suspect going forward, it's going to be harder and harder to truly differentiate on Six Sigma, on ERP, and so forth. So you need an escape route out of the commodity trap. And this is where services, I think, become so interesting and so helpful. Now, a couple of things that are maybe important to note. One is the role that the customer plays. The customer is a much more active part of a service process, in part because services, among other things, are intangible. And that often means you can't fully articulate and express as a customer what you want. Instead, it really helps to elicit the tacit knowledge that underlays what you're looking for and what your providers can offer to you, a more experiential process that can reveal to both what the needs really and truly are. Another thing to do is to think about openness. Having written Open Innovation, I was keen to say, does this mean open innovation is over? And at least in my own view, I don't think that's the case. I think what happens is that you use openness in a different way. And openness now is about gaining economies of specialization, from economies of scope, economies of scale, and economies of skill. And so I'll go through a little bit of that in just a moment. And then the other sort of business idea that we can wrap on top of this, a way to make this truly sustainable as an escape from the commodity trap, is for organizations to think of what they are offering to the world as a platform. Rather than think of it as a product or even as a service, to think of it as a platform upon which others can build. So yes, you're providing parts of it, but others provide as well. And so collectively, you can offer much, much more to the world by opening up your platform and getting others to participate than you can by doing it all on your own. So think about services, it's not about slavery, which is the Latin root of the word. And I think is one of the things that some companies, I think, have struggled with today. They accept that the data show that services are getting bigger, but there's still something that sticks in their throat that says, there's something not quite right here. And what they're thinking of, I think, is the idea that services typically have low social and organizational status in many organizations. And that's not the kind of service that I'm talking about here. The kind of service that is in these statistics, and the one that I think is the basis for advancing both individual organizations and larger economies of many such organizations, is the second definition, where it's the change in the condition of a person or a good brought about by another economic entity with the permission of the first. So there's both a change in the condition of a person or a good and more than one entity involved in that change. So I don't think it's the same process. I think it is. There is an academic debate on this, by the way. And what I'm giving you is one side of this debate. There is an alternative view that says, no, this is actually more or less what we've always been talking about. I'm going to give you the argument about why it's different. And I'm going to go back to our friend Michael Porter, who in 1985 published a book called Competitive Advantage. And Competitive Advantage, as the title suggests, is about how companies can win in the market and sustain leadership against competitors over time. And this is where those generic Porterian strategies emerge. And this is his conception that he introduced in this book about the value chain, where you see activities operating here and support functions here on the way from the laboratory out to the marketplace here. And notice in his conception that service is the very last thing in the chain before it goes out into the market. And so I said it to you a moment ago that services often have a low organizational status. I think it's representations like this that reflect why. Because the real action here is about the product. Do you have a differentiated product? That's a unique, sustainable strategy. If you can sustain the differentiation, do you have a niche market, which is sort of a variation of the differentiation? Or are you a global, low-cost producer? All these conceptions are based on the product. If you think about service this way, it's not where you win. It's not how you beat your competitors. It's not how you sustain competitive advantage. But in an increasingly services-dominated economy, this, I think, is an outdated view. I think a more current view of this would focus primarily not on the product, but on the customer experience that is generated by the organization for its customers. And as I said earlier, some of this means we have tacit knowledge that we have to elicit somehow in engaging with customers. I'll show you an example in just a moment of a way to design some experience points. So as we think about design methods to innovate, one of the moments of truth in those design methods are where a customer and a provider come together and the customer makes a choice at a particular point in the process. And that choice dictates what happens next from that. You can bundle these points together into a service offering, find a way to engage that customer, ideally co-create. Watch what the customer that you've engaged with does. And what the customer does, some of which you would have expected, some of which you probably will not have expected. Because of this tacitness, because of the intangibility of services, customers aren't going to fully know what they themselves want until they work with you in this co-creation process. Some of this goes on in the boundary of the firm, but much of it goes around outside the firm, in the surrounding environment. So there are a variety of stakeholders, participants, contributors to be included in this. And this is one of the areas where openness is so important, is how you engage with the folks outside the boundary of your own firm in this process to deliver a better customer experience. And notice that this is an iterative process as opposed to a linear process here, where the customer gave you a specification here, and then the customer gets the resulting output here, and is not greatly involved in the middle, whereas in this process, the customer is involved throughout the process, rather than only at the beginning or the end. This is one example of a blueprint from Mary Jo Bittner and her colleagues at Arizona State University. And a service blueprint is just one tool to try to design these experience points I was talking to you about. And there are other such tools to be used. But one of the reasons I like this is that there are a variety of customer actions, which are those moments of truth I mentioned a moment ago, where the customer comes into contact with the service and now must make choices. There are physical artifacts that are generated from the actions of the customers. And these artifacts become the fossil record that you can track, measure, and manage in your process. So these are the ways you can start to make this more, what was intangible. These artifacts help to begin to make it more concrete in doing so. Then one of the things we've learned is about the role of the human resources in the system, both the front stage or on stage employees, using the language of the Disney company with their theme parks and the like, and then the backstage staff that support the onstage people in working with the customers in these moments of truth, and then the underlying support processes that support both the onstage and backstage in doing this. So in just one representation, you can begin to see how you can take intangible service processes and begin to make them more tangible, and you can begin to run this kind of a process using these kinds of tools and methods. This is not, what I'm suggesting to you now is not a new idea. A number of people for a long time have taken the view that, contrary to Michael Porter, it isn't fundamentally about the product where you win. Peter Drucker would say that what the customer buys when they buy a product is the utility of what the product does for them. And Ted Levitt, another colleague of Michael Porter's at Harvard Business School, said when people buy a drill, they're buying the drill for the hole that the drill can make. It's not to have the drill itself. It's the utility is the hole that comes out of the drill. So these are very close to the idea of the customer experience. When we think about the utility of what a product does for you, we're very close to the domain of the experience the customer is having. Now to some of the underlying specialization that I think can make this more economically sustaining. So far, we've just been thinking about your offering differently, rather than as a product, more as a service. And rather than thinking of your customer as someone that just generates specifications at the outset, a much more engaged and involved participant throughout an innovation process. To go a little further now, one of the things that can unlock some economic sustainability out of this is the idea of taking fixed assets and utilizing them more intensively. One quick example would be using a car, where if you're like me, I drive about 12,000 miles a year in my car. And depending on the mixture of city and highway driving, I'm averaging perhaps 30 miles an hour in terms of the average speed of the vehicle that I'm driving. So simple math suggests I'm operating the vehicle about 400 hours a year. Out of the more than 8,000 hours in that year, so I have the entire cost of the vehicle, the cost of the insurance, the cost of the maintenance, the cost of the fuel, the cost of the parking, and all the other costs, which, with the exception of the fuel, are fixed, and I'm using the asset less than 5% of the time. If someone can find a way to pool my use of this asset with the use of others of the same asset, all those fixed costs can now be shared or spread over more activity. And this is a way, by boosting the utilization of fixed assets, you can unlock these economies of scale. And one example of a service that's being tested right now that's trying to do this is by Daimler, a service called Car2Go, which are a fleet of all electric vehicles, each of which has a GPS in the vehicle. And in these test markets in Germany and in Texas, customers can find the vehicle on a map on the web because it's got a GPS. And once you get in the vehicle, there's no required time, there's no appointment needed, there's no monthly fee. It's a very flexible use model. And the idea is very much about pooling the utilization of this fleet over lots and lots of people. And because it's got a GPS, when you're done using the car, you return it to somewhere in the test market. The GPS tells Daimler the car's back, it's now available, they can do whatever servicing or fueling might be needed, and then the car is made available for the rest of the network again. So it's all electric vehicles, all GPS, just an example of trying to pool these assets. And if you already have a car and you're thinking, boy, I really like having a car, think about your second car. Think about a car for your daughter or your son. Think about those ancillary uses that you'll use them once in a while. And you could easily imagine where you might have one car you dedicate for yourself, but maybe this becomes your second vehicle, rather than the full costs of it yourself. A slightly different example would be in parcel delivery, where providing a service and then changing the offer of the service unlocks new information and also unlocks new innovation. So in parcel delivery, I'm using the example here of UPS, which traditionally competed for package delivery with a variety of competitors from the shipping invoices of the customers. And so sometimes it would go to UPS, sometimes it would go to somebody else. UPS changed its offering. It still does business this way, but it now has a new offer where it will offer to become the customer's shipping department, meaning they will take all the shipments, regardless of where they go. And so in some cases, they will then pass them on to other carriers. If they've got a better schedule or a better rate, they might still do that. So UPS probably gets more shipments out of those customers where it takes over the shipping department. But that's probably the least interesting part of this. What's most interesting to me is by being inside the customer's processes now, UPS can see the activities inside the customer's operations that are generating the shipment activity out to the parcel carriers. And with this new information inside the organization, they can now introduce new offerings upstream in the supply chain to help manage the supply chain logistics of their customers, not simply the downstream shipments out into the marketplace. So this is a whole new set of services that UPS is now offering based on the additional information it got from being inside the customer's operations activities as the shipping department. I should also add, I mentioned the economies of skill as an important part of what unlocks the economics. We saw economies of scale just a moment ago. If you are a shipping clerk in a company here, and you do your job really well, in a few years you might become the senior shipping clerk of the company. And after that, your career in shipping is pretty much over. There's really nowhere else to go in shipping. You might go to logistics or other parts of the organization, but you can't go very far as in the shipping department of most companies. Your career path is not going to go for a long time. At UPS, however, the same people providing the same function have a career path that can take them all the way up to the very, very top of the organization. So their ability to develop and invest and reward skills and skill activities is much, much greater than the organization performing the function on their own. And this is what I mean by the economies of skill. You get rewards for specializing in deeper specialization in this model in the UPS case than you would in this model in the customer case. And I'm using here the case of Amazon, where they have third-party merchants who use this store, the web store, to access the web page tools to create web pages on Amazon for their offerings. So when you go and you buy jewelry on Amazon, the jewelry is designed through these sets of tools by a third party who does the fulfillment of the transaction. Amazon handles the website and takes the money, but the fulfillment and the shipment come from the third party, not from Amazon. So the clever part for Amazon is they get more and more of our money, what marketing people would call the share of wallet. They get more spending from us without taking on more inventory risk. The inventory is all at the third party. The merchandising expenses are all at the third party. But to the customer, because they're using the exact same tools that are used to build all the other Amazon web pages, it's a consistent experience for the user. So it feels just like Amazon, but behind the scenes, the physical logistics are quite separate. So this is what I mean by economies of scope. So this makes Amazon a more attractive place for the third-party merchants. As more and more of us shop at Amazon and we buy more and more things on Amazon, we are making Amazon the preferred destination for third-party merchants of many kinds of merchandise. And so this is an example of how Amazon and this openness, in this case opening up the web pages, opening up the platform for third parties, makes economies of scope. And Amazon gets more knowledge out of us. And some of you have already worked out, Amazon also sees the entire transaction stream with us too. So all the things that we're buying, whether it's books or jewelry or what have you, they see all of that transaction activity. And in figuring out patterns in buying behavior and people who bought this are more likely to buy that, they have more knowledge than virtually anybody else. They also illustrate the economies of scale that we talked about earlier. In this case, the server infrastructure that supports all the web activity that we were just looking at. Amazon does not restrict that infrastructure to its own activity. It allows others to rent the infrastructure to host their own websites. This is a business that some of you have heard of called Amazon Web Services. And the idea here is that your business and its website can be run and operated by Amazon. And just like car2go, you only pay for what you use. So if business is very good, you have a lot of activity, your bill to Amazon will go up that month. If business is slow and nobody's coming to your site, you'll have less traffic. Your sales are probably down, but so too is your payment to Amazon. So it goes up and down with your business. It converts a fixed cost for you into a variable cost if you are the customer. And that's very cash flow friendly for customers. So particularly for young startups, many venture capital investors now say, don't build your own IT infrastructure. You can rent a perfectly well-managed one here. And you only have to pay for what you use, so don't use our scarce equity investment capital to pay for something like this. Utilize this, because these people are world-class at what they're doing. Most of the businesses that they're funding aren't going to be winning on the basis of their ability to keep the servers up and running. So it's a combination of the economies of scope combined with the economies of skill arguments. How am I in time, by the way? Good. Okay. So taking these ideas of economies of scale, scope, and skill, and then wrapping them together, I wanted to look at another very complex industry, the semiconductor industry, and look at the evolution of the business models in this industry. And you'll see elements of scale and scope and skill all together in this one. Going back in time, when we were talking about those original mainframes and Watson's 7 computers and the like, all the way through into the late 60s, early 70s, computers that were made by Nixdorf or Siemens or ICL or Boole or Olivetti or IBM or DEC or Hitachi, NEC, Fujitsu, all these companies made their own mainframe computers. Each and every one of them had memory functions in those computers that were designed by a sister division of that company. So all the memory was captive. You had to be inside the company to design the memory for the computer that that company made. There were no standards at that time between the memory and the system. In the late 1960s, a startup company called Intel introduced its first products, which were SRAM products to replace IBM's memory in the installed base of its computers with Intel memory that were designed to plug into that installed base. And they were 10 times the performance at no difference in price. And this is where Intel began its business and was the first instance of creating a separation between the design of the system and the design of memory to go into the system. And it became a business model called the integrated device manufacturer model. This is the business model that put the silicon into Silicon Valley. Prior to this time, the memory functions were distributed wherever the computer manufacturers were located all around the world. There were no clusters, there was no agglomeration, there was no community between these places. But with the advent of these standards, now you can design silicon and make it for somebody else's system. There was still a limitation, though, in this model. To do the IDM model, you had to not only design the chip, you also had to build the factory to make the chip that you designed. And that was a very expensive proposition. And in fact, as time unfolded, the chip design costs increased, but the fabrication or manufacturing costs increased even faster, to the point where fewer and fewer companies could actually afford to build their own factories to make the chips that they were designing. By the late 1980s, a company in Taiwan, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, creates a new business model that turns manufacturing into a service. It's the fabless and foundry model, where they build the foundry, the factory that's going to make the chip, and they rent out space to other companies to build their designs in TSMC's manufacturing facilities. So TSMC does not make its own chips. They simply make the chips that others have designed. And by pooling the volumes of those designs together, they fill the factory. And for us as chip designers, we might only need a week or a month or only one line rather than multiple lines inside a factory. And they are the ones that aggregate others' volumes with our own. So again, we're spreading fixed costs over more and more volume as TSMC by providing manufacturing as an independent service separate from the design. This, among other things, allows many new companies to enter into the market, because now to enter the market, you still have to design a new chip, but you no longer have to build the factory to make that chip. So the entry barrier is actually lower because you need less capital to get started. You can rent space on TSMC's machines, much like you can rent space on Amazon's servers. But there's still this problem of commoditization even when manufacturing has become a service. Because what if other people build foundries, and there are now so many foundries that you have over capacity? Then everybody's desperate to fill the space, and the foundries can't charge enough money to return their cost of capital for building the foundries. And this is going on to TSMC right now in China. The Chinese government has very attractive financing and is eager to build up the semiconductor industry in the country. So lots of new foundries are being built in China to compete for the business of these chip designers. So how does TSMC avoid being commoditized here? Well, the answer, and this is why I make this my last example, is how open innovation and services come together. Their answer, and this is their term, not mine, is the open innovation platform. So it's got all the buzzwords. It's got open, it's got innovation, it's got platform. It's beautiful. And what that does is it takes the internal intellectual property of TSMC to both design and then manufacture the chip, and the external intellectual property of third parties to design and manufacture the chip. And the platform takes all of that together. And what it does is it allows the external suppliers who are building for TSMC because of its leading market share in the industry, they do all the testing and validation of the third-party intellectual property with its own internal intellectual property. And by testing all the possible ways these things could be used together, they can validate the processes for the customers and assure them that if you adhere to these tested, certified, validated processes, your chip will work the first time through successfully. So this is a very difficult task for other companies to compete with, because all the external suppliers want to go to the biggest company first because they have the most capacity. So TSMC is the first ones to see the newest stuff. And then because they see the newest and they see the most, they have the most to test together. It gives them a real lead and a sustainable advantage. So stepping back from the individual examples, let's try to sum up both my abstractions and some of the earlier arguments around the complexity of services science generally. I think one thing that I haven't really demonstrated to you, but I'll just assert it again, and maybe we'll have some discussion about it, is that I think in many organizations, services is not a high status part of the organization. And this suggests that that's wrong, that services, if properly conceived, can be not only an important, but maybe a key sustainable differentiation for your business. For many organizations, thinking about what you offer to your customers, what the utility of it is really critical. To get out of the mindset of the product as artifact, but the utility of the artifact is really important. This is where ethnography, sociology, psychology can be so helpful in an innovation process, as they are very skilled with a number of methods to get people to separate the artifact from the role and purpose of the artifact. This is where their training is so helpful. There are tools increasingly where you can begin to experiment and map processes and translate the intangible to more tangible representations that can be also, among other things, very good communication tools to manage in a team or between one team and another team in a process. Looking for underutilized assets that aren't being shared, that could be leveraged, and offers to your, this one in a sense interacts with the offering, because in some cases letting them rent the service of an asset rather than having to buy the asset outright enables new value propositions to be made. And then the business insight of creating a platform that connects the products and the services, much as TSMC does here, is another really important way to think about differentiating and sustaining what you're doing. So that's what managers can do. Back to the research side. SSME, I think, has already reached a peak, if you will, and is beginning now to transform. We're seeing things like, on the private side in IBM, Smarter Planet. But we're also seeing initiatives in open cities, open data, open government over here. And I think what the ideas here are going to be very helpful in these kinds of domains. And so those of you working in these domains, I think, can get a lot from what's been done here. But there's a lot that we do need to do. In addition to more research, well, okay, what kinds of research do we need? And I would look at a few things. I would look at the infrastructure that we're going to need to make this all possible. That's going to be not just private, but importantly the private and shared common and open spaces to enable that. We're going to have deeper, richer conceptions of those T-shaped elements I talked about, skills, being able to interact with customers, being able to separate the artifact from the utility, etc. We're going to need different rules and job classifications. So I talk about giving service organizations more power. This is part of what I mean here. And there's going to be a whole lot of contextual, cultural aspects needed that are going to interpret what's going on down here. So there's a lot of work that's going to have to be done here. One of the things that I'm encouraged by is just the last 5 days, there's been the proposal for the Horizon 2020 program for the European Commission. And this is still very much in the gestation process, so this is not the end of the process by any means. But where the process is so far, from what I can tell, is that they have decided to focus directly on multidisciplinary grand challenges, rather than more traditional discipline-based or discipline-bounded allocations of research funding. They're taking a multidisciplinary view to the actual funding, which is quite fortunate given what I was saying to you a few minutes ago about how we need to be multidisciplinary and looking at service systems. It turns out there are going to be 80 billion euros over 7 years that are going to be spent using this conception. Now, it's early days and we'll see how it all sorts out finally. But I think I take this as encouragement that this very important process in allocating research monies seems to be compatible with some of the things that we're talking about that we need to build, to extend these ideas of service systems, service innovation, value co-creation, multidisciplinarity, and so on. And as some of you know, Jim and his colleagues have been very effective at getting a number of courses offered in universities. There's a nice analog with the computer science progression of the 1950s and SSME in the first decade of the 2000s. It's given rise to some very good books that they've written. These two are primarily for the academic community and are very rich resources. If you're not familiar with either of these from Springer, I highly recommend both. You'll find a lot of good work there that you might be able to build on. This one, I don't know about this one. The author I'm a little unsure about. And it's also trying to write for a different, more of a management audience. But if you get into the footnotes, you'll find a lot of the things that are here as well, albeit translated into a more managerial language. So thank you very much. There's a lot more to talk about, both about this topic, about open innovation, and if you want to reach myself or Jim, we would love to hear from you, and here's how you can find us. Thanks very much.
Hello. I think we can find 5 minutes for questions or comments to Henry before we proceed to lunch.
Hi, Alex Borg from the Cambridge Service Alliance. So, Henry, where do you see basically the role of information systems research and service sciences over the next few years?
Well, I think I hope one point you got is that, and I'm already seeing this in some of the posters as I was walking around in the garden and in the coffee area. I think one role is not only be deep, but think of ways to connect to others. So it isn't just about doing applied research, but applied research in a deep way. So you're actually making a deep connection with another area, another field. A lot of the things in information systems assume we know what the goal of the project is, and then we work out how the information system is going to be constructed to deliver that. This is suggesting you don't know, and the customer doesn't know in full what it's going to be at the outset. That is something that has to be co-evolved or co-created as part of this. So think about all the things you already know how to do well. Introduce that need for co-creation that initially means it's much more ambiguous, and then you have to find ways to clarify, iterate, and then get to something that may not even be what you initially would intend, but maybe you get to a better outcome. So those would be some of the implications, I would say, for the information system research, is broadening the context where we take the disciplinary skills that we have to a greater effect. Thank you.
Having looked at definitions of products and services quite a lot, I've come to the conclusion that it's futile to try to distinguish between products and services. Almost every definition that you could try, you could easily come up with counterexamples and so on and so forth. So do you think that it would be fruitful to just give up on that distinction and say that we're producing something that's a product service, basically, and just has different characteristics, and that makes much more sense than continuing the way we have?
Well, it's a good point that these definitional arguments become pretty fruitless at some level. And you'll notice in many of my slides I'm talking about service systems. You know, if you look at what's in those service systems, there are an awful lot of things in those systems. It's not just processes, it's not just flows and information. There's some things there too. So that's one attempt to try to get past the arguments. The reason that in my translation I start with the products is I find with most organizations I work with, they have a mindset that they start with. So if you are in a research context where you don't start with that, I think you can start absolutely from whether you call it a service system or some other aspect. But when you're trying to engage with an organization, you also have to take their context in, and at least so far, I find most organizations are still in that world. And that's why I was saying earlier, I haven't supported it yet, but I find many organizations don't give services much priority and much attention. And the people who are at the senior levels in the company came up through the product side of the business back when maybe there was a more meaningful distinction between those things. To use a personal example from my former life, before I became a professor, for 10 years I worked in a hard disk drive company called Quantum that made Winchester disk drives. And we had a service operation, but we gave it away for free. And our services were simply used to make sure the customer didn't return the product. And that's all we wanted service to do. If the customer kept the product, we could book the sale, record the gross margin, and get on to the next one. And in that conception of service, the people are doing that. It's a cost center. It's a low status position. It's not winning business in the market. It may actually be helping to make the sale, but the systems don't record that. Even the accounting system records it as no revenue, only cost. So it's this kind of a context I have in mind when I talk about these definitions.
Very good. One last question.
First of all, thank you for an interesting and inspiring talk. My question is about service and e-service. The e-service, what is the definition of e-service? Clearly a subset of the service term. I come from the e-government field, and I think we tend to use e-service for everything, and thereby emptying the concept of its meaning. And I think we will have a great problem in interoperability issues because of this. I'd love to hear your opinion about this.
So I saw a poster on e-service out in the cafeteria area. Was that yours?
Yeah.
Oh, that is
I guess
yours.
so.
Oh, okay. So I was going to suggest you go to the poster, but it sounds like you know it well. I think e-service in part derives from what we called at one point in time, about a decade ago, e-business, when the world was waking up to the dot-com revolution and everything was moving from the physical transactional world to online, and we were now transacting online. And terms like Web 2.0 come out and all this. I think where I see this going is, I mentioned open cities, open data, open government. It isn't simply about taking a transaction that you now have to go into a government office, moving that transaction onto a server and transacting. That's the beginning. I think what's really powerful is taking the data generated from those transactions and exposing that to the community and allowing people to see the pattern of data and transactions and allowing them to build applications and services on top of those data resources so that citizens can have access and make sense of not just their own individual transaction, but the context of a variety of these activities going on. To me, that's a very exciting development. And in some of the Framework 7 programs, there are already, I think, 6 cities that have test beds where this is being attempted. But as your question suggests, what data format? What's the reporting? Are there any reporting standards for how these things are going to be done? It would not surprise you to learn that not only do cities keep data differently, but different departments in the same city keep data differently. So there's a lot of difficult work at the infrastructure level to get data formats to the point where we can begin to make comparable comparisons of the data, both for citizens and also for us as researchers. But this is, I think, an area of great opportunity right now.
Thank you very much.